Everyone who gets close to Jerry Cantrell eventually faces the same question. What actually happened between him and Layne Staley? For 3 decades, Jerry gave almost nothing away. A glance to the side, a measured pause, a few careful words, just enough to satisfy a headline and nothing more. But now, at 60 years old, having outlived Layne by more than 2 decades, he is finally speaking in a way that does not simply confirm what people suspected. It changes the entire frame. This is a story of 2 men so completely bound to each other that when one of them was gone, the other had to learn how to exist from the ground up. The truth was always present, buried in Jerry's silence and in one album that never received the attention it deserved. What he has now confirmed is far more layered and far more human than any version the rumors ever managed to capture. Jerry Cantrell was carrying fresh grief when he first encountered Layne Staley. His mother had died just 3 weeks earlier, and he had no particular reason to be at a small theater in Tacoma, Washington that night. He was not networking. He was not chasing an opportunity. He was simply trying to get from one end of the day to the other without falling apart entirely. Grief does that to a person. It creates a kind of glass wall between you and everything happening around you. You are present but not quite connected. Then the band started playing, and something broke through. The singer on that stage had a voice unlike anything Jerry had prepared himself to hear. It was not polish. It was not performance. It was something rawer than that. Power sitting right alongside fragility, as if both were completely inseparable. It did not just sound good, it felt true. And in that particular moment, for someone carrying what Jerry was carrying, truth was the only thing worth holding on to. Several months later, they crossed paths again at a party in Seattle. Nothing significant had changed for Jerry in the meantime. He was still broke, still without stable ground, still moving through days that asked more of him than he had to give. Layne read that immediately and responded without making it complicated. He offered Jerry a place to stay, a rehearsal space known as the Music Bank. The Music Bank was not a home by any reasonable definition. It was loud, constantly occupied, rough in every direction, and it never really went quiet. But for more than a year, that is where both of them lived. 2 young men pooling whatever scraps they had, space, time, the small daily habits that form when 2 people are just trying to hold things together. No plan, no structure, no roadmap, just the unspoken agreement that neither of them had to navigate alone. What developed between them was not the result of intention. There was no strategy behind it, no calculated approach to building a sound. It grew from proximity and from honesty, from being around each other so constantly that pretending was simply not an option. Their voices began finding each other naturally. Their creative instincts started overlapping. The music they made together did not reflect where they hoped to be. It reflected exactly where they were. Jerry would later describe it as imprinting. 2 people so close, so unguarded, that they shaped each other at a fundamental level. The vocal interplay, the harmonic language, the emotional texture that would come to define Alice in Chains. None of it was engineered. It was a direct result of 2 people being too exposed to each other to be anything less than completely honest. Something began there that would prove, in time, to be nearly impossible to separate. The story that circulated for years was clean and convenient. When things got bad, Jerry stepped back. As Layne became more withdrawn, more unreachable, those closest to him simply were not there anymore. It is the kind of narrative that satisfies quickly. One person needed help. The other did not show up. Straightforward, emotionally legible, and easy to assign. But it is incomplete. A second version went further, suggesting that by the late 1990s a relationship had fully collapsed. No communication, no contact. The entire foundation of Alice in Chains reduced to silence and distance. There's a thread of reality inside this version. Tension genuinely existed. There were disagreements about whether to continue making music, about what direction the band should take, about what the future even looked like. Layne, caught in a depth of personal struggle that made forward movement nearly impossible, could not engage in the same way he once had. Jerry still wanted the music to continue, wanted to hold on to the thing they had built, push in a direction that created friction. The gap between them widened. That part is true. But a gap is not an ending. The harshest version of the story goes further still. that Jerry saw clearly how serious things had become and still did not do enough. This version positions one man as the passive observer of another man's destruction. It assigns guilt with the confidence of someone who had full information and full access, neither of which anyone actually had. It is also the version that requires the most simplification to hold together. The reality is that contact did not fully cease. During a period when the public had largely concluded that Layne had been abandoned, Jerry was giving interviews in which he confirmed that visits were still occurring. And then something happened that no one had arranged. Layne called into a radio program while Jerry was being interviewed live. Unplanned, unprompted, spontaneous. Whatever the distance had become, it had not erased awareness of each other. There were tensions, genuinely. Communication became inconsistent, especially during periods of disagreement about the band's direction. Neither man was navigating from a position of stability. Both were under pressure. Both were making choices inside circumstances that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. And here is a detail that most simplified accounts quietly leave out. Jerry was not watching from solid ground. He has acknowledged openly that addiction was part of his own life during those years. He did not get sober until 2003, after Layne was already gone, which means that for the years people imagine as one man declining, while another watched helplessly, both of them were struggling, simultaneously, in different forms and at different rates, but struggling nonetheless. That changes the picture entirely. It was not a story of stability, watching instability from a safe distance. It was closer to two people moving through difficulty in parallel, without the tools or the footing to pull each other fully clear. When that is understood honestly, the urge to assign simple blame starts to lose its grip. The situation was defined by shared limitation, not by one person's failure. Some endings do not announce themselves. They arrive slowly, like a conversation that trails off without either person meaning for it to stop. And then enough time passes that going back feels impossible. That quiet, unresolved quality is what makes the final chapter of Layne and Jerry's connection so resistant to clean summary. Even as Layne became almost entirely unreachable in his final years, music had not completely left him, according to accounts cited in the book Alice in Chains, The Untold Story by David DeSola. There are reports that he was still recording at home as late as 2002. One of the songs associated with those sessions is believed to have been titled Every Day. There are also suggestions that some of that material may have been intended to reach Jerry. It never did. On April 5th, 2002, Layne Staley died alone in his Seattle apartment. He was not discovered for several days. When he was finally found, the physical reality of what his final years had taken from him was stark and overwhelming. The distance between the person who had once held stages in the grip of his voice and the person found in that apartment was not something that could be absorbed quickly or without lasting damage. For Jerry, the news was not abstract. It was immediate and total. He later described that stretch of time as among the most destabilized periods of his life, and he was not in a stable place to begin with. Grief landed on top of everything else he was already carrying, and the two became inseparable. Work on a solo album called Degradation Trip continued through all of it. The record was not made under comfortable conditions. It came out of a period defined by substance use, creative strain, and accumulating loss. The disintegration of Alice in Chains in its original form, and Layne's death arriving in close succession. The album was released not long after Layne died. It was not a formal tribute, but it carried the weight of that period in every corner. It was later dedicated to Layne, a quiet acknowledgement layered into something already deeply personal. One small detail from this time reveals something that formal statements rarely can. Jerry took in Layne's Siamese cat, Sadie, who had been with him through his final years. He cared for her until 2010. It is not a dramatic gesture. It does not make headlines, but it is a kind of quiet, sustained act that shows connection continuing in the only form still available. Responsibility carried forward when everything else had been lost. A year after Layne's death, in 2003, Jerry got sober. The proximity of that shift to the loss has been noted by many who followed his story. It does not reduce to a single cause, but something in that period made continuation in the old pattern impossible. The weight had become too much for the existing structure to hold. The years around that turning point were not orderly. They were layered and overlapping, grief and creativity and instability all occupying the same space at the same time, without clean borders between them. Music continued. So did disruption. Nothing resolved on a clear schedule. What that period left behind is not a tidy arc of loss and recovery. It is something messier and more honest than that. When Alice in Chains returned to public life in 2009, the tone was not triumphant. The album that announced their return was built around loss, and its central song, Black Gives Way to Blue, featuring Elton John on piano, made no effort to obscure that. This was not a comeback built on energy and forward momentum. It was built on the act of finally saying goodbye to someone who had been gone for 7 years. What most people did not know was what was happening to Jerry's body while he was writing it. During that period, his health began breaking down in ways that resisted medical explanation. Severe, persistent migraines, constant physical pain. The symptoms escalated to the point where doctors ordered a spinal tap to rule out serious neurological conditions. Nothing definitive was found. No clear physical cause. The body was reacting in a language that standard medicine could not fully translate. Jerry spoke about it directly in later interviews. The grief, he explained, had not been processed in years since Layne's death. It had been stored, held in place by the pressure of working, of not stopping long enough for it to surface. And then, years later, it forced its way out through the body, because there was nowhere else left for it to go, not as a single acute moment of sadness, but as sustained, sourceless pain, pressure without an obvious origin, the physical expression of something that had never been fully released. Black Gives Way to Blue became the container for that release. The song does not reach for drama. It moves at the pace of someone who has finally stopped running, slowly, with tremendous restraint, and with a tone that sits closer to acceptance than to explanation. It is not written to revisit the past or to make sense of it. It is written simply to acknowledge that it happened and that it still exists. The shift in Jerry's creative approach after 2002 is not subtle once you know what you're looking at. His work from that point forward does not carry the same forward drive that defined his earlier years. The pacing becomes more deliberate. The emotional register moves away from expression and towards something closer to examination. Things still move, but nothing rushes. It is controlled in a way that earlier work was not. Part of that shift connects directly to how Alice in Chains was constructed from the beginning. The band was built around two voices in conversation. Not one voice supported by another, but two voices genuinely responding to each other. Jerry has explained that many of the songs were written with that dual-layer structure embedded in the composition itself, even when not all of it was performed in full. The space for a second voice was always built into the architecture. In music made after Layne's death, that architecture remains. The songs still feel like they are structured for more than one presence. There is room inside them that nothing fills, a harmonic shape that implies dialogue even when only one side of the conversation is audible. That pattern is still present in Jerry's 2024 solo album, I Want Blood, which received wide critical recognition. One of its tracks, Afterglow, carries the same quality of unresolved reflection. It does not point directly at specific events or name specific losses, but its structure leans backward rather than forward, toward something unfinished rather than toward conclusion. It does not resolve. It recognizes. Some things, the pacing seems to suggest, do not close neatly regardless of how much time passes. What ties all of this together is not symbolic, reading layered onto music from the outside. It is a pattern that repeats consistently across time. Physical symptoms connected to emotional memory, compositions shaped by absence, and structural choices that continue leaving room for a voice that is no longer there. That is what separates this from a conventional grief narrative. It is not a story about reaching the other side of loss. It is a record of how unprocessed experience keeps reshaping everything. Health, creativity, the very way music is built, across decades. What Jerry Cantrell has clarified in recent interviews is not a single dramatic disclosure. It is something quieter and ultimately more significant. A consistent repositioning of the entire story away from the versions that took hold in public memory, towards something more accurate, more uncomfortable, and more fair to both people involved. Across interviews from 2024 and 2025, one position keeps returning. The relationship with Layne Staley was never one-directional, not in terms of influence, not in terms of creative contribution, and not in terms of shared responsibility for what happened and what did not. The first thing he pushes back against is the hierarchy that public storytelling quietly installed over the years. In the popular version of Alice in Chains, Layne is the tragic center, the voice, the face, the story, and Jerry is the steady architect working in the background. Jerry's response to this framing is direct. The band's identity did not come from one person leading and another supporting. It came from two people shaping each other continuously, building something that neither of them could have produced alone. The sound, the emotional weight, the structural DNA of the band, all of it emerged from genuine exchange, not from a hierarchy that assigned one person the role of artist and the other the role of foundation. Central to this is something that rarely gets proper attention. Layne shaped Jerry as a singer. Jerry did not start out thinking of himself as a vocalist. It was Layne's insistence, his encouragement, his belief that Jerry belonged in that role, that pushed him toward it. The two-voice structure that became one of the band's most defining characteristics was not something anyone planned. It grew from Layne's conviction that Jerry had something to offer as a singer, and from Jerry trusting that conviction. Without that, Alice in Chains sounds fundamentally different, possibly unrecognizable. Jerry also addresses the question of addiction without deflection. The public narrative tended to locate Layne at the center of the band's decline, the one who struggles to find a trajectory. Jerry has been clear that this is an incomplete picture. Substance use existed on more than one side. The difference was not moral. It was a matter of timing and outcome. Surviving did not mean being in control. It meant the consequences arrived differently, not that the struggle was absent. On Grief, his framing is equally honest. He does not describe loss as something that happened and then resolved. He describes it as something ongoing, something that continues to appear in his work, in his memory, and sometimes in his body. The language he uses in interviews does not soften toward closure. It maintains the weight of continued absence. The experience, in his framing, has not finished happening. It is still present in the way he writes, in the space he leaves inside songs, in the way certain memories remain fully intact rather than fading. Finally, he addresses a question that followed Alice in Chains' return directly. Was continuing without Layne a form of erasure? His answer is unambiguous. Continuation is not replacement. When the band reformed with William Duvall, the intention was never to overwrite what existed or to pretend the past was resolved. It was to carry it forward without pretending it was gone. Memory and continuation are not opposites. Survival does not require forgetting. Taken together, what Jerry has confirmed is not a rewriting of history. It is a correction of the distortions that simplified history introduced. A story where influence moved in both directions, where struggle was shared, not concentrated in one person, where continuing was not a betrayal, but a form of honesty about what still existed. One final detail has stayed with many people who followed this story. In 2010, on the same night Alice in Chains performed in Seattle, the city where Jerry and Layne first found each other, Layne's cat Sadie died. Jerry learned about it after coming off stage. A quiet coincidence, unremarkable by any external measure, and somehow impossible to fully set aside. What looked for years like rumor was always something else. A connection that did not have a clean ending, because some connections are not built that way. They continue, in whatever form they can, until even that is no longer possible.